Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Brennan Center for Justice event. For those of you joining for the first time, the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works to repair, revitalize, and when necessary, defend our systems of democracy and justice. I am L.B. Eisen, Senior Director of the Brennan Center's Justice Program, where I lead the organization's work to end mass incarceration. Our team works on rigorous research that produces cutting-edge public policy ideas to improve the fairness of our justice system. Our recent work has focused on incentivizing states to reduce incarceration, highlighting the inefficiency and injustices of our system of criminal and traffic fees and fines, examining and addressing racial and economic inequities in the criminal legal system, and attempting to improve conditions behind bars for so many who are trapped in our prisons and jails. Of course, the research we do would be incomplete without the stories of the individuals who are impacted by our justice system, stories like the one we'll hear today. Now, to this afternoon's program. I'm so pleased to introduce you to our esteemed moderator for this afternoon, Laura Coates, the Chief Legal Analyst at CNN. Here to join her in this important conversation about the death penalty is Alex Marr, journalist and author of this beautifully written book, 70 times 7, A True Story of Murder and Mercy, about the harrowing, real-life tale of a 16-year-old sentenced to death for a horrific murder and the forgiveness and compassion that came after. We also have Josie Duffy Rice, whose work as a journalist and host of the podcast Unreformed has helped shine a light on the injustices of our justice system. All of these fantastic women have done and continue to do such important work in this space, and we are so grateful to hear from them this afternoon. Laura, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you so much, LB, for that wonderful introduction. And I want to thank everyone out there who has taken the time to be a part of this incredible dialogue that is so necessary. And this panel truly informed and will enlighten us all. And you can follow along the conversation, everyone, on social media with the hashtag Brennan Center Live. We are going to leave some time for questions at the end of this powerful discussion. And if you have a question that you would like to ask, just please feel free to add them either via YouTube or the Facebook chat. And we'll get those in later in the program. I don't know if you realize this, but just 5 nations carry out the overwhelming majority of death penalties in this entire world. Those countries are China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and the United States. And according to recent surveys, most U.S. adults are actually in favor of the death penalty for people who have been convicted of murder. However, most Americans also believe that the death penalty is applied in a racist manner. It doesn't deter serious crimes and doesn't have enough of the safeguards needed to try to prevent the execution of those who are truly innocent. Now, there is a new book, as we've talked about, and we'll get into today as well. It's called 70 times 10, A True Story of Murder and Mercy. And what this book does is it details the 1985 case of a woman named Paula Cooper, who killed a 78-year-old Bible teacher in a violent home invasion. Now, she was condemned to death row for a crime that she committed when she was 15 years old. Too young at that age to register to vote, to have a driver's license, to consume or drink alcohol lawfully. And the book is truly a testament, you'll find in our conversation today, to the real lives that are impacted and, of course, upended when this sentence was handed down, and to questions that must be asked when it comes to the death penalty itself, such as what are we really looking for when we talk about and speak about this concept of justice? How do we define it? Where does empathy fit into all of this? And should it fit in to our legal system? So with that in mind, and the conversation about to unfold, I am so excited to bring to you journalist and author Alex Marr, who's on our expert panel here today, for this very riveting discussion. Now, 70 times 7 has been named already a New York Times Book Reviews Editor's Choice. It's also one of New York Magazine's best books of 2023 and also an Amazon editor's pick. Also joining in this discussion with Alex is the esteemed Josie Duffy Rice, who is a journalist and also host of the podcast Unreformed. Now, Josie has spent her storied career working to shine a light on the injustices of our American criminal justice system, especially the dark shadows of the history of juvenile incarceration. And just a quick note, everyone, for those of you who are tuning in, that Alex book is actually available for purchase at the link in the live chat. Again, it's called 70 times 7. So let's get into our discussion. Ladies, I'm so glad that both of you are here with me today. Let me begin with you, Alex, on this important day, because the story of Paula Cooper, maybe many people have never heard of or unfamiliar with, to obviously the extent that you are. What was it about this particular case that had you so invested in it?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, it's great to be talking to you today, Laura. And, as you mentioned, this is an extraordinary case. In 1985, a 15-year-old girl committed this terrible crime. She killed an elderly woman during a robbery gone wrong. And a number of months afterwards, in spite of her age at the time of the crime, in spite of being so young, she was sentenced to death. The coverage around that case really focused on the scandal of someone so young participating in this act of violence, right? But there was very little talk about the scandal of us sentencing someone of her age to be executed. So for me, that was one of the big factors, the age that Paula was at the time, just 15, and the fact that the death penalty was still on the table for someone that young. Until as recently as 2005, you could execute someone of that age in this country. The other piece of it that absolutely drew me in, so that I ended up spending 5 years researching and writing this story, was the fact that the adult grandson of Paula's victim, against the wishes of his family, his friends, his congregation, the whole community, decided to publicly declare that he was forgiving this girl for killing his grandmother. I'd never at that time encountered someone who'd made a choice like that. And I knew that I wanted to try to understand why he'd made that decision and the impact that it had.
I think that's such a fascinating principle, because so often we think about justice as a kind of vehicle for vengeance. And we oftentimes, knowing that many cases, I know from being a prosecutor, it's the United States versus, or this jurisdiction versus, the victim of a crime and the families who love those victims, of course, are sometimes removed from the equation, because it's not a personal litigation dispute where you have an individual being named, you got a jurisdiction against the individual instead. And so when you have someone like a relative or somebody who might otherwise be expected to try to use the justice system to exact a kind of vengeance and justice, what was the motivation for that person to say, I forgive? What was there an impact in and of itself of having made that statement in the courts?
Oh my goodness, absolutely. So the victim's name was Ruth Pelkey, and her grandson was a man named Bill Pelkey, who otherwise had no identity as a sort of a politicized, outspoken activist or organizer. He worked at a local steel mill in the Gary area, and that was it, and he felt moved to speak out on behalf of his grandmother, because he believed she would not have wanted this young person's life to be taken in her name, right? And so he spoke out, he wrote a letter to the editor, he spoke out to any reporters who would talk to him. And what happened is it completely changed the dialogue around this case, which was really extraordinary. So you had a debate locally about the death penalty in Indiana overall, in the Midwest, because of this case, that really people shook out according to their political views, whether they were on one side or the other. But once a murder victim's family member speaks out and says that they disagree with what the prosecutor's agenda had been. They disagree with this person receiving the death sentence. It makes the conversation deeply personal. And it's a lot harder to dismiss a family member who says, you know what, the system got this wrong. And as a result of that, that was a big part of why the case then started to get picked up in the European media. This case was covered all around Western Europe. I mean, it went huge across the ocean, and particularly in Italy. And as a result, the way in which the United States and our justice system was being portrayed abroad in relation to this case was then covered in the US media. And so the conversation around this became a lot more complex. And suddenly the question was not, how is it possible that a young person has committed such a violent act? It became, how is it possible that we have a criminal justice system in the US where a young person can be sentenced to death row? And that had a huge impact.
I want to bring you into this, Josie, and that conversational point, because I think for some people it might otherwise be startling to know that you're talking about a case from the 1980s. But it was only as recently as 2005 when the Supreme Court said in the case called Roper versus Simmons, everyone out there, that juvenile offenders could not be sentenced to death. And we're talking about obviously a minor at this instance. And I would note, this is not a case of exoneration. Alex is not writing about a case of somebody who did not commit the crime, but an exploration of the sentence and the punishment and the retribution that was exacted. Talk to me, Josie, about this case in particular, but also more broadly. Why is it that when a mirror is effectively held towards the United States of America, what is it that it's reflecting to you?
Oh, gosh. I mean, we have an incredibly, incredibly punitive system that is also particularly random. I think the most important thing to remember about the death penalty is that there are only about 0.1% of prosecutors in the country who seek death sentences, right? There is really no consistency around death sentences going to the worst of the worst, or the worst punishments going to the worst crimes. There's so much discretion and randomness in politics in our criminal justice system that encourages a level of punitivity that, again, is mostly unmatched anywhere in the world, if anywhere. And I think that's part of the reason that this story resonates and why this book is so tragic and so important, is because it really traces the circumstances that led to this child, a kid, being put on death row. And you understand very intimately that it's not because she was the worst offender in the country. It's not because she did something that no one had ever considered could happen. It was because of the circumstances that surrounded this particular incident that end up being very divorced from the actual harm that is caused.
Alex, what are the circumstances that are being alluded to? And I wonder the impact, is so often we're talking about the death penalty. And I remember quite well, even in the confirmation hearing of our now Attorney General, Merrick Garland, who infamously was a prosecutor who had pursued the death penalty as well, spoke about changing his viewpoints towards the death penalty, largely in part of the way in which, as Josie referenced, it is sometimes sought, the discrepancies along racial lines, the race of the victim versus the race of the perpetrator, and of course, the discretion that comes into play in all this. Were all of these factors at play in this particular instance?
I mean, as Josie was talking about just now, that certainly what we have with capital punishment is we have a process that is broken. We know for a fact now that if the victim of a violent crime is white, the perpetrator is much more likely to face the death sentence, receive the death sentence, right? So we get a sense that there's different kinds of value put on different lives in this country, and then the system responds accordingly. In this case, Paula Cooper was a young Black woman, a girl, and her victim was white. And in Gary has, as a community, as a city, a long history of segregation, right? And that was very evident in the 1980s. The neighborhood in which she committed the crime had been an all-white middle-class neighborhood for a very long time, until shortly before the crime took place. So all that was in the mix as part of the system. I think one thing that was incredibly significant, in addition, was this was the 80s. This was really the beginning of that kind of Reagan-era tough on crime, law and order talk. The whole tough on crime stance goes back to the Nixon days too, but this was in full swing. So even though Lake County, where the crime took place, was a Democratic county, the prosecutor was a Democrat, he had run on a tough on crime platform, and he was eager to demonstrate to his constituents that he meant it. He went for the death penalty 22 times during his term as prosecutor. And initially, there were 3 other girls involved with this crime who were involved to a lesser degree. Initially, he wanted to pursue death for all 4. They were 14, 15, and 16 years old. So this gives you a sense of what was in the air at the time. And there wasn't that much of a dialogue about the kinds of things that were at play in Paula Cooper's childhood home. There wasn't as much talk about child abuse, of which she was certainly a victim. There wasn't as much talk about, why was she a chronic runaway? That came up a lot in the press, as if it was somehow a demerit for her to be running away from a traumatizing home environment, right? And so you see someone who was placed again and again in juvenile detention with kids who had committed real crimes, and then sent back home. And then by the time she's 15, we're supposed to be surprised that there's a chance of her snapping under particular circumstances. So that was something I really wanted to establish in the book before the reader even gets to the details of the crime itself. And that wasn't as much of a part of the conversation in the media when the crime took place.
Mm-hmm. Josie, now when we're looking at sentencing, and it's hard sometimes to look at these issues from a present day perspective, when we know that certain factors like the sentencing memos are created and the so-called crimogenic factors and one's background, and these pre-sentence report is issued that allows somebody to interview members of the community, the family, the person who has committed the crime and now been convicted of it, to get a sense of sort of this holistic notion. And I do not suggest this is done in any way perfectly, but far more expansively than Alex is alluding to what happened back in the earlier 80s. But when you factor in all of these circumstances, there will be those who will still look at a death penalty case more broadly, and they'll say, look, so what if the person is being made an example of? They have put themselves in this position, and we will reserve our sympathy for the death penalty for only those who who ought to have been exonerated. What is your reaction?
Yeah, I think my reaction to that is twofold. The first is that this system is unjust, it is biased, and it is cruel to everybody, regardless of what they have been accused of doing. And the question is less about, as Bryan Stevenson says, the question is less about what that person deserves versus what we deserve, what we have the right to inflict on people, right? And so to me, the question of guilt and innocence versus the question of a fair system have been are not in perfect overlap at all. Obviously, we don't want innocent people in prison, but if you take all the innocent people out of prison, there is still cruelty being enacted on people who are there and have done a lot of harm. I think the second thing is, and this is particular to juveniles, the way that we treat juveniles in this country who are accused of particularly of serious crimes like murder is beyond comprehension, which you both have alluded to already here. It's just beyond any reason. any mercy, any care. It is outside of the standard deviation of what how any country should treat kids, even kids accused of a lot of harm. And part of the reason we do that is because of what we saw a lot in the 80s was the sense of, instead of thinking, here's someone who is literally a child and has done something wrong, maybe their youth is, maybe the older they get, they'll grow, they'll change, they'll be different. At that time, it was sort of a thought of like, if someone can do something at this age, they must be a sociopath, they must be a terrible person, they must be hopeless. And though we don't put kids to death anymore, we don't sentence them to death anymore, we do sentence children to life without parole. And though that's been shifting somewhat, it has not shifted all the way. So there are people who did something as a child, and the court said to them, "We don't think there's any way you can ever change." And to me, that is not just cruel, but it's an arrogance. It's a wishful thinking of our need to castigate people accused of wrong in a way that really ultimately harms all of us.
I want to make sure everyone is aware. We want this conversation to include you as well. It's very important for all of you to be a part. If you have a question, please feel free to add them via YouTube or in the Facebook chat. What Josie is speaking to, Alex, I mean, irredeemable is the word that I am getting. The idea that there are some people that society deems there have no redeeming qualities whatsoever. And I cannot help but, having been on the front lines of this, although I've never prosecuted, and that was by intention in a death penalty jurisdiction. The idea that we decide who gets the benefit of the doubt, who has the ability to change, and this is a childhood mistake. And I do not want to minimize the loss of life and what the family of any victim of homicide is enduring. But we certainly, in a variety of crimes, have decided that there are some people who deserve a benefit of the doubt, who deserve lenience. Is it because I can see myself in you and what that means? When you looked in this book and thought about that, did you have a sense of what the jury pool, what role they're playing in that notion of how they look to see who gets that quality of the benefit of the doubt?
Right. Well, so out of the 4 girls involved with this crime, only one ended up having her case go to trial, and she was sentenced harshly. Paula, ultimately, it came down to her public defender deciding to take a plea in a capital case with no deal on the table. So already her initial defense was problematic. But what you talk about, that sense of, people wanting to recognize something of themselves in the defendant, I think that is truly how a lot of the system plays out. One of Paula's appellate defenders had made the comment to me. He started out in juvenile court as a juvenile attorney, and he said repeatedly he was so frustrated because the way he heard the judges discuss what a teenager was, it was always in reference to a normal 16-year-old does XYZ, and that normal 16-year-old was from a very particular white suburban community that the judge could relate to, right? And there was not nearly enough value and weight being given to other factors that may be playing into shaping the kid sitting in front of you on trial. And so that was incredibly important in Paula's case. She was seen very much as a monster. I mean, the press truly made her out to be a sociopath. That's the language that, Josie brought up. She wasn't someone for whom people were asked to sort of wonder what went wrong in her childhood environment, despite her age. And of course, we also know that at this point, we know through studies that there is a greater tendency within the system to age up Black children, Black teenagers more quickly than white children, white teenagers. So sometimes in the system, there are those critical moments, but the jurors or the sitting judge are more willing to see this individual as, well, as responsible as an adult when you get down to it. That's a part of the culture and the system right now, in terms of how willing we are to try children as adults. We don't have a federal minimum age. So you have a number of states where someone as young as 12 can be tried as an adult, and it's not an issue. And so that sense of, perception plays a huge role here. And one thing that really came into play in writing this book, I connected the dots between Paula's case and Roper v. Simmons in 2005. What took place, what had to shift in order for us to bring an end to the death penalty for kids. And part of that is a conversation about, what's our national consensus on what is too cruel and unusual as a form of punishment. And shockingly, we needed that much time to catch up and decide that it was too cruel to potentially execute someone of 15 or 16 years of age. And so now that conversation, that debate continues around life without parole, because we are the only country in the world that still sentences kids to die in prison. And I think, that the much bigger question that raises, that's an enormous one for all of us, is, what does that say about what it is we're trying to accomplish? What does it say about whether or not we think anyone has the potential to be rehabilitated and to change over time? If you're saying that someone who's 16 or 17 doesn't even have an outside chance of being able to transform over time and contribute back to society.
And the rehabilitation aspect of it, we know there are a variety of different, our words we use oftentimes to talk about the goal of our penal and justice system to avoid recidivism, someone coming back and committing more and more crimes. Retribution, obviously, another one. Rehabilitation, mostly people think about that one as a particular prospect of it, although sometimes I wonder if retribution is outweighing that in a lot of the philosophies. But to your point, Josie, it's one thing, perhaps our society is patting itself on the back since 2005 to suggest, well, at least we don't execute any longer. But a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old, a 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, life in prison without the possibility of parole is a kind of death.
It's a death sentence.
And so, exactly. And so we talk about if there's an older person who commits a crime and, they're in their 70s or 80s, they'll often say, well, if it's a 10-year sentence or whatever the number might be, they'll say it's the equivalent of a death penalty case, et cetera.
Right.
What is the court's logic that distinguishes it between an execution and a life without the possibility of parole? What was the notion that the court was looking at back in that case to suggest that this is the clear distinction that society has to be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, it is not just the courts, right? It's reflected in kind of the entirety of the myth of America, of a just country, that we draw these somewhat arbitrary lines, right, between equally or at least similarly harmful punishments. It is totally true that life without parole is a death sentence. It is not an execution, but it is a death sentence. And the court had for 15, a little bit more than 15 years, maybe been moving in a more progressive direction when it comes to punishment in juveniles. So, again, in 2005, the Roper came down saying that you can no longer sentence children to death. And in the years since, even life without parole, the ability for people to sentence jurisdictions to sentence children to life without parole has narrowed. But they've always kept an exception, right? And part of the exception that the court articulated, and in the one of the more recent cases about life without parole, I guess this was probably 2016 or 17, was that the possibility of someone being irreparably corrupt, right? Irreparable corruption. Again, this requires a skill, a magic that the court doesn't have and nobody has, the ability to be able to know what a 15-year-old will be like at 75. If anybody is irreparably corrupt, that's not something that our system is capable of predicting or deciding. And yet we see time and time again that the American legal system plays into this fiction that we have the ability to predict the futures of people who have done serious harm. And the truth is we don't. And that it is simply fiction.
You know, what we're talking about and orienting the conversation around this extraordinary book that you've written, 70 times 7, Alex, and the life of Paula Cooper, and really using that as a jumping off point to the larger conversation we're having here as well. But a lot of the conversation we're having about the notion of, you know, whether someone is redeemable, whether somebody is irreparably corrupt, all the different terminology, some could look at this and say, well, this could apply to somebody else. Say the person's 21 years of age, say they're 30 years of age, whatever it is. We do make a clear distinction between somebody who is a minor and the development and the maturation process that would be physical, intellectual, emotional. We know that now in different ways. But I wonder about not only that disconnect, but more broadly, we know that President Biden has called for a kind of a moratorium, right? A moratorium when it comes to the federal death penalty. He vowed to end it. Again, I referenced earlier the statement of our Attorney General Merrick Garland, who does not want to have those, according to his statements. But the DOJ is still seeking, in some respects, these cases, or seeking at least the penalties. Why is there a disconnect between that statement from the president and, of course, the Attorney General and what we're seeing in practice, Alex?
My sense is that it is really hard with an imminent, incredibly important campaign cycle about to ramp up to make a crusade to end the federal death penalty a part of your public persona. I think that politically, the Republican Party continues to define the conversation when it comes to how we deal with violent crime, right? As soon as a Republican candidate starts using that tough on crime phraseology, it works because it's emotional. It pushes emotional buttons. And when the public is maybe a little less educated about how particular practices play out in reality, the idea of electing someone who's going to be tough on violent crime it's an easy sell, and frequently it's a win. So I think that, for a lot of Americans, capital punishment is still associated with that idea of, if we're going to be tough on crime, we need that as the ultimate option for the worst of the worst, and we don't want to let go of that possibility. I think that a big part of that is that the average American doesn't have all of the facts about how capital punishment plays out in reality, that it costs more money to pursue the death sentence and to have someone then appeal that sentence over 5, 10, 15, 20 years than it does to give someone a long prison term, right? It doesn't, the death sentence is not meted out within a reasonable period of time because of the necessary appeals process. Someone being executed for a heinous crime does not necessarily universally create a sense of satisfaction for the victim's family members. There have been interviews, studies, surveys that show that to be the case, right? And also the death penalty is not an effective deterrent. It's certainly not with young people at all. So a lot of these fallacies are out there in the public eye, and it's hard to shift the conversation, especially when, I think that a number of Democratic candidates and elected officials tend to respond to tough on crime talk from the other side with wanting to meet like with like, instead of really trying to educate the public about some of the alternatives we have to long-term incarceration, to capital punishment, to these sort of severe punishments. Those do not have a great track record in terms of making our communities and our families safer. So I think, there's this bigger question of how do we shift that public conversation, and then you can have a Democratic administration that will actually follow through on some of these promises because they know they'll be able to connect with the public on those points.
I mean, Josie, of course, some of the alternatives you're speaking of and how courts have implemented other ways to approach punishment have been sort of the alternative court systems, drug court, mental health treatment, and beyond, as just part of it, probation, kind of second chances. But you rightly point out, Alex and Josie, you know this quite well as well. We're 500 plus days away from yet another presidential election. And one of the big topics that will be there as well in the congressional races and local jurisdictions has been this idea of people perhaps wanting to distance themselves from the impression of being soft on crime. We can all recall that the Supreme Court Justice, then nominee, Ketanji Brown Jackson, was looked at unfavorably at times as being quote unquote soft on crime because she was a public defender. Now, of course, as a prosecutor, I can tell you, every person in a courtroom is supposed to be thinking about the rights of the defendant, prosecutors, judges, and of course, defense counsel. So I guess the whole system is soft on crime if that's the criteria. But nonetheless, there is a notion that soft on crime, as she's describing, is going to be a factor. Are you concerned that because of the way that so-called progressive prosecutors have been viewed, have been attacked, because people are looking at increased crime rates and wanting to double down and suggest the red versus blue cities and states, that the implementation of the death penalty for those who are quote unquote irredeemable will be used more frequently or sought after more frequently to prove something politically?
Was that question for me? I'm sorry.
Yes.
I'm going to interrupt it. Okay. I think I have a couple responses to this. The first is that this is the oldest political trick in the book, calling the left and progressives and Democrats soft on crime. We have been, the party and the political orientation has been responding to that essential troll with harmful policies for decades. And ultimately, the evidence shows it's not working. What we see here, if we're discussing a country that has, more people in prison than any other country in the world, and yet still has a higher crime rate than many other similar nations, what does that tell you about this system? What it tells me is that this is not an effective system for addressing the harms that we want to actually address. And so I always find myself screaming at the TV every election cycle, begging for someone to point out just the absurdity of the conversation around tough on crime, because, we see what works and what doesn't, and this doesn't work. But I would say that overall, the death penalty has fallen much, is becoming less and less popular. It is still, still more than half of the country, when surveyed, says that they support the death penalty, but it is a lower number than it's been in decades. I mean, I think since the 70s, maybe even before the Supreme Court overruled the death penalty in the 70s and then reinstated it 4 years later. So I both find the current situation around the death penalty to be depressing and hopeful, because the truth is that we actually do sentence far less people to death every year in this country than we did even 10, 15, 20 years ago. The death penalty is used by far fewer jurisdictions, and we seem to be moving away from this idea that the death penalty itself is serving as some major deterrent, as Alex said, from people committing harm. So I don't know what to predict. I mean, I can't predict American politics. That much is very clear to me at this point. But I am not convinced that we really can, at least in any sort of immediate future, go back to where we were around the death penalty when 300, 400 people a year were getting death sentences.
I want to go to the questions from the audience who really want to be a part of this discussion, but I do want to ask you, Alex, like without sort of ruining the book, which everyone should be reading. It's called 70 Times 7. What happened to Paula Cooper?
Oh, well, so I mean, that does give away a lot in the book, I will say. But it's important, I think, for people to know that her sentence was commuted ultimately. You know, she ended up with some great appellate attorneys, and the case was taken to the Indiana Supreme Court level. And for various reasons that I trace in the book, it was decided that she was too young for the death penalty. And her case was what inspired Indiana to raise its minimum age for death, which at the time, most Hoosiers in the state didn't realize the minimum age was 10 years old, right? So, and then
well, I won't make you, I'll do a cliffhanger there. I won't let you give anything else away, but I wanted to know specifically in terms of the case as related to the death penalty, because it is such an important book, and to have that context and that background for people to know the story. And again, there is the cover of the book, 70 times 10, a true story of murder and mercy. And there is Paula Cooper on the bottom part of the screen. And of course, the woman that she killed above, I believe she was a Bible school teacher as well. Let's turn to the audience. I want them to be a part of this conversation. Let's go and see what kind of questions you have. Let me begin with one of the first ones I see. And the question is, did Paula Cooper receive any therapy in prison to aid in her rehabilitation?
Well, that's a great question. You know, one of her initial appellate attorneys, Monica Foster, who went on to become the federal public defender for Indiana, Monica became very close with Paula. She was only a small number of years older than her, a few years out of law school when she was assigned to the case. And she really was so moved by seeing this incredibly depressed young person on death row that she went out of her way to try to make sure that Paula would have access to some tools to keep her going while her appeal was, you know, making its way through the system. So as I mentioned in the book, Monica actually ended up paying for a therapist for Paula to see while on death row. One of the fears was that if she went to see someone that the state provided through the women's prison, that anything that she revealed might make its way into testimony in a legal context. She just couldn't trust within that scenario. So you had someone who was really, you know, terrific attorney who felt connected to her client, who tried to go that extra step. And then once Paula's sentence was commuted, she ended up taking part in a lot of programs inside the system that were available. And she went from being, honestly, a really terrible inmate in the sense that, you know, she kicked back a lot. She was furious at her situation. She'd been in the system since the age of 15. So I think we can all imagine her state of mind. But she did end up getting professional training, skills-based training. She got her high school degree and a college degree. And all of this was self-motivated and trying to find ways to make use of opportunities within the system. So really, I think one thing for viewers right now to really keep in mind is whenever you see coverage of programs being taken away from these facilities, one headline that's came out this week in New York State is the possibility that, you know, inmates will not be allowed to publish their artwork or their writings any longer. And that takes a lot away from the ability of residents of these facilities to try to change.
But
right?
what's the logic of that? I mean, here's something like, what is the harm? What is the logic that they have said in terms of trying to not allow for the publication of even artwork? What is the sense behind that?
I don't fully understand it, since this is, you know, I've just read one piece thus far. This is news to me. But my sense is that one of the catchphrases was that it has to do with safety and security, right? So that somehow that these residents of the facilities are going to be divulging information about the facility and how it's run. They're also, you know, supposedly they'll be forbidden from mentioning anything about their crime, even something as simple as saying, you know, I'm incarcerated for this reason, right? And those are the reasons being given. We're talking about also, it looks like maybe a 60-day waiting period for approval before anything might be considered for outside publication, which would just squash any outside projects you might have going on. And so I think, the question I keep coming back to again and again in all of these scenarios we've been discussing is, what is it we're trying to accomplish? People go in and they come out. Who do you want coming out of this facility and returning to the community? And also, when someone's sentenced, it's a finite sentence. If it's not capital punishment, it's not life without parole. It's a finite sentence. But it seems that culturally, we keep tacking on to that sentence so that there's really no end to the process of trying to make amends.
Yeah.
Josie, I know you wanted to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I was just going to say it was probably a safety reason, but it reminds me that, of how many facilities in the past 10 years have gotten rid of in-person visits. Now you can only use a tablet, or you can only, you have to pay this certain amount of money to get access to Securus or whatever it may be. And, the reasons for that are always vary between, like Alex said, safety concerns, even though, people worries of family bringing in contraband, even though the people who bring in contraband to prisons are far and away usually the guards, not the family members. But also this sense of, well, this is, we're streamlining, we're becoming more efficient, we're making it easier. What we are doing is taking people who are trapped in a cage most hours of the day, if not all of them, and taking away their ties to community, the other things that they love to do outside of this prison sentence. We're taking away the parts. We're really trying to just destroy them as humans is basically the goal that so many of these policies ultimately have, because otherwise they're just really not logical. It doesn't make sense that this is the way that you would try to rehabilitate people, unless your primary goal, your overarching goal, and your often solitary goal is punishment.
I'd like to add one thought there, which is that something that really hit home for me for the first time in writing this book was the sense that there's a family on either side of every one of the cases. If you walk into a courtroom, there's a family on either side. And one of the things that was perceived as so radical when Bill Pelkey reached across the aisle essentially to Paula Cooper was that, so many things about the system are antithetical to that kind of gesture. Right. So a prosecutor's agenda is often complicated if someone from the victim side wants to reach over and try to find some humanity in common with the family of the defendant. And so, I spent a lot of time trying to get to know and portray Paula Cooper's sister, Rhonda, who's just a few years older than her. They were incredibly close. Right. And her friendship with Bill as well and his family members over the years. That relationship, that reaching out across the aisle ended up being truly transformative for everyone involved. And I bring it up at this moment in our conversation because when we make it harder for people who are incarcerated to be in touch with their family, when we make extend what's eligible for a capital charge, it's having an impact on people who had nothing to do with the crime. And I don't think that the average person in this country really thinks about it that way. Paula came with her sister and her brother-in-law and people who cared about her, right? And on Bill's side, Ruth Pelkey, the victim, her family loved her dearly. You're having an impact on this entire, small community of people who are brought together by this terrible crime. You're not just penalizing the perpetrator.
And the ripple effect, the idea of cruelty or counterproductivity and all the different aspects of what you describe. And I certainly have seen firsthand some of those moments that bring tears to your eyes when you watch a family of a victim advocate on behalf of the person who has committed the crime against their loved one, desperately crying things out, like not their son too. It's just something that you don't always see or imagine to be the case in our world. There's other questions, a couple of them we've touched on a bunch, but I want to make sure that we bring in the audience who is riveted by this discussion. And it's such a timely and important one as well, ladies. One big question is, how would Paula Cooper's case be handled today? Alex, do you want to address that?
How would it be handled today? Well, the death penalty would not be on the table, and that's really the biggest distinction here. Beyond that, I would have to assume that she would be eligible. The prosecutor in the case would be pursuing either life without parole or a very long prison sentence. But Josie, I don't know if you have additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would underscore the randomness of some of this, right? So I don't know who's prosecutor in that county right now. I don't know what, there are just so many kind of outside of the control of the actual incident variables that drive sentencing decisions. But I think it is certainly less likely now than it was in 1985 or 1986 that she would get as long of a sentence, and certainly not the death penalty. But we haven't rehauled this system entirely. It's not that now we would see this 15-year-old and try to get her treatment or try to address the problems that the root problem here, or try to make sure this didn't happen to any other kid and Gary, right? We would still punish her in a way that did not actually address or solve the issue at hand. And so I think it's both important to note, as Alex said, that this case came at the beginning of a major shift in the American criminal justice system, and that we are in some ways better than we've been, but we have a long way to go until we're good.
Let me ask on that point. 1 second, Alex. I want to get back to that question, and I just want to honor the audience who's participated. I'll try to bring these two together. We've been talking a little bit about those who've been vulnerable as youth. One question from the audience is, how often have mentally ill inmates been put to death? And the other question, I think both of you have incorporated, is what alternatives should be put in place of the death penalty? Alex?
I don't have the actual numbers on the number of mentally ill individuals who've been put to death, but I can say that a change in that practice had a big impact on bringing an end to the death penalty for teenagers. So because it was ruled unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court to sentence mentally ill adults, intellectually challenged adults specifically. It was ruled unconstitutional. That teed up some of the most effective pieces of the legal argument for Roper v. Simmons in 2005, because the understanding was, if someone is of intellectually a diminished capacity, they should not be held as culpable as an adult who is not. And so, I think that when we're talking about the mentally ill, I think it's a really complicated topic.
The umbrella term in and of itself, so far too expansive to identify.
There should be a logical legal argument kind of connection between talking about intellectually challenged, talking about juveniles, saying that they should not be eligible for death, and then talking about the mentally ill. But how do we define the mentally ill? Some might say that anyone who commits a violent crime has mental health issues. But Josie, I don't know if you have further thoughts on that.
Well, I agree. I would agree that some of these definitions are so slippery and vary across questions, right? I think that has been true also for intellectual disabilities. We saw the court outlaw the right to put people with who are developmentally disabled to death, as you mentioned, Alex. And now we just see over and over the two sides of a death row, the defense and the prosecution going back on and forth on whether or not this person is sufficiently developmentally disabled. So it ends up often I mean, we still put people who are developmentally disabled to death. So it only sort of worked. And I don't know that it would work for mental health. What I can say is that every single person who's on death row right now, I am comfortable saying every single one of them has endured a serious trauma. One of my best friends practices defends death penalty clients in Alabama, and she says every single client she's ever had incredibly serious childhood trauma that affected the entire direction of their lives. That doesn't mean we excuse heinous crimes, but it means that when we isolate people to the single event in question versus being able to tell a story about their life, I mean, Paula Cooper's the perfect example of that, then we just don't approach anything close to justice.
There is a necessary conversation about cause and effect, and it's far more expansive than starting with the actual crime that is alleged to have happened. And I'm glad that we've had this dialogue. I do want to leave you all with one last question, if you wouldn't mind answering. And that is, what is the one thing that you want our viewers to walk away with today from this conversation? I'll begin with you, Josie.
Well, I have two things. One thing is that you should absolutely read Alex's book. It's incredibly written. It's beautifully told. I loved it, and I really recommend it to anybody who's joining us. But I think the other thing is that we really have to grapple as a country with how we treat not just people who are not just defendants in the criminal justice system, but children who are accused of doing something, of committing a violent crime. The way that we treat children in this country still to this day in the criminal legal system, the fact that we are willing to sentence children to life without parole, even if we can't sentence them to death, represents a true rot at the core of this institution. And I think Alex's book just does an incredible job of highlighting how a system like this can go wrong.
Alex, what is the one thing you hope people will walk away with today?
I think I would say that, whenever the topic of the appropriate response to serious violent crime is raised, we have to stop for a moment and ask ourselves, what are we trying to accomplish, right? It has to go beyond retribution, because retribution alone does not give us safer communities, safer environments for our families. It doesn't. So what is the bigger picture result that we are looking for? And is the solution, is the correct response, the wiping out of another human life, whether it's through the death penalty or life without parole, or is there another kind of process that we're willing to consider? So the book in some ways also looks into restorative justice as a possibility. And certainly Bill Pelkey was this incredible example where he was able to move forward with his life and to heal by reaching out to the girl who had killed his grandmother. And without having had that opportunity, I don't think he would have been able to process what happened to his family in the same way. So really, what is it that we're trying to accomplish, and then acting accordingly?
So powerful to have both of those moments, and thinking about the poignant thoughts you both conveyed. I truly hope that everyone, when they hear the phrase "speak truth to power," they're able to first know what the truth is. And conversations like this really get us that much closer to being able to articulate how we're feeling, what we want our society to be. And I want to thank the Brennan Center for having this very important conversation today. It is available for you to view again as well. The name of the book by our esteemed author today, 70 times 7. I want to thank Alex Marr. I want to thank Josie Duffy Rice as well. I'm Laura Coates, Chief Legal Analyst for CNN and Anchor, and I thank you all for joining us here today.